All right, welcome everybody. This monitor is kind of in the way a little bit. Sorry about that. I'm Megan Swanson. I'm an assistant professor of psychology in BBS, and I am thrilled to be here kicking off the 14th annual Children and Families Spring Lecture Series. It's amazing that the series has been going on for that long. We have a great lineup for everybody this year. We're having our first lecture today. And then our next lecture is actually April 8th, where Dr. Kane Slavish will be talking to us about sleep. You'll see in the slides here that are rolling through behind me the rest of the events that are happening. We're really excited this year that we have an outside speaker coming in to do our Keystone lecture, and that is Kim Nobel, who's going to be talking about her super interesting study that she's running right now and papers that she's recently published. So before I introduce the speakers today, I'm just going to go over a few pieces of business. We do have folks here virtually with us. Yay, it's so nice to see everybody's faces, and virtually via Teams. So we're doing a little bit of a hybrid approach today. And with that said, we are going to ask that folks hold their comments until the end of the talk, unless you have a quick clarifying question. If you're in the room, I'm sure the speakers wouldn't mind if you ask a quick clarifying question. And for those of you that are joining us via Teams, Rachel Bergland and myself will be monitoring that, and we'll let you guys know if anything comes up. So don't feel like you need to monitor anything in Teams while this is going on. After the talk, please complete the form on the talk. Those of you that joined us in person should have picked it up on the door on the way in. Is that right? Does everybody have it? Okay, wonderful. And then you can drop it off when you leave. Rachel's going to be posting a link to that in Teams for those that are joining us virtually. All right, so to our talk today. The talk today is titled More Than Words, the Impact of Environment on Children's Language Growth. And we're fortunate to have both Dr. Mandy Maguire and Dr. Carlos Benitez-Barrera co-presenting this talk today. Dr. Maguire is an assistant professor in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Did I say assistant? Oh, sorry, associate professor. As soon as that came out of my mouth, I was like, that's not right. Her research focuses on socioeconomic status, influence on brain and language development. She has published extensively on this topic in journals including Developmental Science, Human Brain Mapping, and Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience. She's also received funding from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation to support her research. And this funding includes a current grant that we have going on right now through the Center of Children and Families. It's an NSF-RU, which is about providing research opportunities to undergrads. And a quick plug for that, we are currently still accepting applications. Awesome. So if you have any classes with undergrads who would like to participate in the RU program, we can provide you with the link to apply for that. Our other presenter is Carlos, Dr. Benitez-Barrera, and he is a Callier postdoctoral fellow, and he's mentored by Dr. Maguire. He earned his PhD in 2020 from Vanderbilt, and his research focuses on how low language outcomes in children from disadvantaged households is related to the quality of their home communication environment, and that's actually the topic and part of our talk today. He has received funding from Ash Foundation, the New Investigator Award. And we're actually really lucky to have him here today because his days at UTD are numbered. I have it on good authority that he recently accepted a position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, right? So congratulations to Carlos. We are thrilled for you, but we're very sad to see you move on. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off, and I believe Dr. Maguire is going to kick us off first, and I will help get this switched over. Does it go down? Okay, that would be really helpful because.
There we go. Yeah. All right.
Okay, so I'm going to close this one for you, and then I'm going to leave that to you. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, and I'll get this. Give me a second to get it set up. And then, like I said, I teach in this class, and I teach in this class hybrid, so I should know how to do it, but it's always an adventure each time. So let's go with slideshow, play from current slide, right? And then I need to share with you guys, and make sure you get my sound. Okay, I think we're all set up. All right. So it's great to be here. I am so excited to be in person, and I'm excited to kick off our series that looks just absolutely fabulous. So this is our first time, welcome, and welcome to everybody online. So what we're going to be talking about is the impact of the environment on children's language growth. And what we know in the field of developmental science is that, we've done a lot of research in the last couple of decades looking at what really supports, what is the best language environment to support language development. So we've looked a lot at parent-child interactions and what is really good within those parent-child interactions to lead to good language development. And what we found are things like the quantity and quality of language matters, right? So you go back to classic Hart and Risley studies, and we know that the more words parents say to kids, the better. But also the quality of those words, so the range of different words they're saying and how they're embedding those words. All of that matters a lot for early language development. We found this over and over and over again. We also know as kids get older, we have to look at conversational turns. So you can't just talk at them, you have to let them talk, right? So they get practice from talking, but they get so much more than that. So in conversational turns, you take something like a kid saying, my feet are cold. And the mom says, oh, your feet are cold? Let's go get you some slippers or some socks. Or how about that warm fuzzy blanket you have upstairs? Do you want that? And the kid's like, yeah. And the mom's like, okay, we'll get the blanket. In that exchange, there's so much information. So one, the kid gets agency, right? They communicate and they get a response. And when something works, like communicating, you do it more. So that encourages more communication and more advanced communication. You get a range of different words that are all related. So the word feet and socks and slippers, all those go together and that builds this nice rich semantic network, right? So you learn about slippers in relation to socks and slippers in relation to feet. That's really important for building this language foundation. They also get information about syntax. So the kid says feet, but the mom says feet. She does something called reframing. So they give something like me feet is cold and the mom says it back to them correctly. And all parents do this in a way that just seems effortless, right? They're like, oh, your feet are cold. And what kids get from that is the correct syntactic formation for that sentence. So they said it wrong, and the parent doesn't have to say, no, we don't say feet, we say feet. But they give that little bit of feedback, and the kids learn from it. So these conversational turns give information about communication, about pragmatics, about semantics, about syntax, and all of that helps build a really nice foundation for our kids' language development. All of this falls under kind of a broader term, which is usually called maternal responsivity, but really parental responsivity, right? So how responsive, when we talk about this in language development, what we're talking about is how responsive are the parents in the environment to children's communicative attempts, right? When a kid is trying to communicate, do parents notice that and react to it? And that can be conversations, that can be quality language, but you can see that this is something that we see right at the beginning at birth that develops over time with the kid. So for an infant, this might be like an infant sits there and babbles and goes ba 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 ba, right? And a responsive mom does the same thing right back and says ba 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 right back to the kid. And then the kid does it again and they stop talking and let the kid do it. That seemingly really simple exchange, again, has lots of information in it. Kids hear their own auditory kind of what it sounds like when they make those noises. They feel motor movements of what that does. They look at their parents, hear similar sounds. They see their parents' lips. We actually do studies looking at eye tracking, and they're not just looking at the eyes, they're looking at the lips and getting information back about how to produce those sounds. As kids get older, it's not necessarily even language anymore, but if a kid points to something, does a parent notice that and respond and get that object for them? Again, agency, right? If I communicate, do you respond? And when they get much older, we get things like, do parents label what the kid is interested in versus what they're interested in? So your classic example of a kid at a birthday party who's way more interested in the wrapping paper than the toy, right? And is the mom willing to be like, hey, okay, the wrapping paper, yeah, it's blue and look at these balloons on it. Or are they going, no, 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 look at the toy. We got the toy. Let's look at the toy. It's the parents that really say, all right, let's follow what the kid's interested in that support language development because the kid's already interested in it. So label it. Don't try to distract them, move their attention and now label something. So all of these things are really how attuned are parents to the kids' needs to communicate and their desires to communicate. And that gives, again, conversational turns, quality language. We see high variability in this among parents. Some parents are really good at it. Some do it less naturally. Within a parent, like my conversational turns with my kids, when I try really hard, it's there, right? I'm like, we're having a good conversation. This morning when we're getting ready for school and my kid's telling me the 100th time her story about like how Jacob is annoying her in class, and I'm like, are your shoes on? Are your shoes on? Where's your backpack? Like, that's not that good conversational turn, right? We're not giving quality of language, but we all range in this. So as developmental scientists, we can say, cool, we figured it out. Like, this is it. This is what we need. We are good to go. It turns out we've been missing a really, really, really critical piece of what a child's environment is. And that's that children are raised in incredibly noisy environments. When we do the studies that I've talked about, what we do is we bring in one mom and one kid and we put them in a quiet little room and we let them interact. And we even have like a sign on the door that's like, be quiet, there's a study going on, right? There's no other kids, no other noise going on. And we're like, all right, what happens between this parent and this child? Well, this is removing a huge part of what is real life for children. There's noise in their environment. How are they reacting to the noise? And this is where working with Carlos has been great because he comes from the background of audiology. Well, they're always interested in noise, right? Noise is a huge factor, and how are we forgetting about noise as one of the factors that matters? So what we're going to talk about today, or what I'm going to talk about, is some background about what we know about what a child's auditory environment is like, how that might influence their language development, what we know about that, which isn't a lot, honestly, how it might influence their overall development, being exposed to chronic noise. And then we're going to give you some preliminary results. Carlos is going to give you preliminary results from a study that we have looking at this. And this study has been really fun. I want to give like a little props to this because this was an idea that Carlos had even before he came here. So when he was at Vanderbilt and he was applying for the Callier postdoc, he came to me with this idea. And I thought it was great, and we worked together on a collaboration. And then since he's been here, we've taken a much more holistic approach to the child through collaborations with faculty here at CCF and at UTD. So looking at parent-child interactions with like Jackie Nelson and Shayla Hullab and Margaret Owen, and saying, you know, the parent is also there, right? There are other people in the environment. How are they being affected? Looking towards generalizability. So what happens in kids who are at risk for language disorders, and talking about ways that we could take what we're doing here and apply it to kids who may be at risk for language delays or disorders with Dr. Raul Rojas and with Lisa Kaufman. So this is kind of the key pieces. We're going to give you results that are related to the core questions that Carlos had in his initial projects. They're preliminary, but I hope you can get excited about like what we want to do in the future with this. This is also an area where a lot of the REU students that Megan mentioned at the beginning, we have these undergraduate students, a lot of them are doing projects with these data sets that I think are going to be incredibly exciting. So let's get to that. See, it's going to be so much fun. All right, so what are the auditory environments that kids are in? What do we know about them? Well, the ASHA Foundation, or the American Speech, Hearing, and Language Association, recommends that language is at plus 15 dB SNR. So what does that mean? These are all things I've started to learn. SNR means signal to noise ratio. So specifically, what is the signal, meaning the language, in comparison to the noise surrounding it in decibels? And what we want it to be is 15 decibels higher than whatever the noise is around there. So if you look at this, kind of what the range of sounds are and what the decibels are, you know, if you're trying to talk to someone and there's other people talking in the background, so let's say they're at 60 dB, then you need to be 15 decibels higher than that to be heard. And really to be heard in maximal, where you can get the most information that you need from the language signal. So you need to talk about the level of a truck, right? If you have a hairdryer going, right? So we have a hairdryer up here somewhere. I remember seeing that one right here, 90, then you need to talk like louder than a helicopter, right? So the idea is if you are in a noisy environment, how do you account for that and speak louder in relation to that? What does that signal need to be? So what does that sound like? And we realize for people in here, we're going to need to turn on the microphone. And this is an example of classroom at 15 dB, which is like, all right, this is good. Wait, no, it's not. Hold on.
So far this year, we've just been talking about science. Science is all about discovering new knowledge so we understand the universe. Like, scientists might go out and they might say, oh man, I just discovered this new galaxy super far away. One moves to America, get your hand down.
Okay, so you guys hear, like, you can hear it, right? It's a little distracting to have all this stuff in the background, but you can definitely hear the speech. So that's what ASHA says you should be at. So you can be in a noisy environment, but be 15 dB above and we're good. But what environments are kids actually in? Well, research on classrooms shows that the classroom ranges between +2 and +11 dB. The limited research that we have in homes, and some of it coming from Carlos's work, shows it's really variable, but around 8 dB. So what do you notice about both these? This is less than 15 dB, right? So kids are not in the environments that ASHA says they should be in. Now, granted, these are really variable, right? There are loud times and quiet times, but overall, they don't seem to be getting the signal that they need to be getting to get optimal language. And this is just across the board in environments where they need to be learning, like a classroom, and in, the home where they're getting a lot of their language. So what does this sound like? So this is 5 plus 5 dB, which we'll come back to because other studies use this a lot. So keep this in mind as you kind of think about what this is.
So far this year, we've just been talking about science. Science is all about discovering new knowledge so we understand the universe.
It's a lot of
Scientists might go out and they might say, oh yeah.
So that's plus 5 dB. Let me turn this off. Okay, so that's what we know about what a kid's environment is like. Well, what does that do to their learning? If you're in an environment like that and trying to learn, what are the effects of that? Well, we know in general, and you guys probably all felt that, while listening to that, there's a lot more effort and a lot more fatigue. And actually some studies Carlos and I have done with adults using EEG, you can see that in the brain. You can see the effort that is there. There is a whole other layer of cognition that is necessary just to attend to language when there's other things going on in the background. And over time, this leads to fatigue, it leads to problems, it leads to an inability to concentrate. So all of those are going to be problematic for learning. The few studies that have really been done with kids to look at, things like word learning find, again, that it's problematic. So this study by McMillan and Safran, they brought in kids and did a very, very typical word learning study. So these are toddlers, I think they had 2- and 3-year-olds, and they did what we classically do in studies where you give a new object and a new label. And they're like, look, this is a blicket, this is a blicket, this is a blicket. Can the kid learn that that's a blicket? Of course, like 99.999% of studies, they do it first in silence. The kids do great. They all learn it. Then they also did it at plus 10 dB and at plus 5 dB. So plus 5 being what you just heard. At plus 10, learning goes down. At plus 5, none of the kids learned it. They could not learn that word in that context. And again, this is not uncommon in a classroom, right? The thing that was interesting was that if they first said the word, even without the object, so if you said blicket to the kid before you taught it, and then there was noise when you teach it, then they could learn. So the real problem wasn't that they couldn't concentrate. It was that they didn't have access to the speech signal. Once they could learn the word, then they could learn the attachment even if it was noisy. So authors really say, even if you're in a noisy environment, periods of quiet are really important, and maybe you can help build some foundation in those quiet points. Another study looked at this more related to a classroom, and they brought in kids who are 5 to 8 and did just a language comprehension task in various levels of noise. And what they found is on average in plus 6 dB, so again, a little bit better than what we had just listened to, the 5 to 8-year-olds all struggled. They all really struggled with language comprehension, but the kids who struggled most were the youngest kids, right? The kindergartners and first graders, who most likely have the loudest classrooms and most likely really need that foundational language. They're the ones who aren't getting it. So this language is really going to matter, right? This environment is really going to matter to how they're learning. We also know that noise exposure is different across different groups. So there are differences in low-income homes where you are exposed to higher levels of noise. Now, a lot of research in this has been done just in urban planning, and we know that incomes that cost, or homes that cost less, so generally low-income housing, especially in cities, tends to be near noisy things, near highways, near train tracks, near airports, right? All of that noise matters. It's getting into the homes. We also know that you're more likely to have multi-unit homes when you have less income, right? So you're living in apartment buildings where you're hearing your neighbors, or in houses that are very close together where you hear the neighbors. Low-income housing also is made with poorer building materials. So there's less acoustical stopping. They don't have the buffering of those sounds. So all of that leads to differences in external noise related to income. What's been studied much less, but something that we're really interested in, is what are the factors of internal noise? There's more overcrowding in low-income homes. So you tend to have more people living in a smaller space, and that can have an effect on this. There's also just generally cultural differences about number of people who live in a home, right? Lots more multi-generational homes, or having aunts and uncles and cousins and parents living in the home. This can be independent of SES, but there are cultural differences in this where you have more people. This leads to really interesting questions that haven't been addressed. That's more language. Shouldn't more language be good? Shouldn't more adult language be good? But what happens when it becomes speaker noise, like you guys just heard? Then it becomes distracting. So when is language moved from being the signal to being the noise? Is it good to have 3 adults in the home or 4? Or is that now too noisy and chaotic? Does that become problematic? We honestly don't know. So there haven't been studies to look at this. But this is the environment many kids are raised in. And again, our studies are like mom and a kid, right? We don't look at that. Another factor is media, and especially television, radio, background noise that's going on. That tends to be more common in lower income homes. And I want to kind of pull out from this and talk about what we know about the influence of television on language development. So in a lot of research, decades of research, we have found that the more TV that's on in a home, the worse the child's language outcomes. This has been done mainly through parental report. You just ask a parent, how much TV do you watch? This weekend, how much TV was on in your house? And the more TV that's on, the poorer the kid's language outcomes, regardless of what the TV is. This is even true when it's educational TV. So we know that television is related to poor language outcomes. Why is that the case? And there are a couple reasons. It might be the signal to noise ratio. Having background TV on gets in the way of kids hearing the language around them. It might also be related to the parent-child interactions, right? So there have been a couple of studies that show that parents that have the TV on more have lower quality and quantity of language. Another study using devices within the home found that when the TV is on, it led to fewer conversational turns, right? So that idea that the media is actually affecting the parent-child interactions. Now there's a whole new area of research beyond this that's interesting that's called technoference, which is the idea that technology gets in the way of parents interacting with their children. And a lot of the research here is phones, right? Like if I'm on my phone texting or playing Wordle, which I play, right? Like then I'm not responding to my kid. And that technology is getting in the way. It's influencing that. So you have background TV noise as one potential aspect that could be influencing the parent or the child. You also have the parent affected by media and the way they're affected by it. All of these could be playing a role. So there's been this indication that in general, we know that media in the home is a problem. However, I have to say there are these other things that have come up, right? We have the American Academy of Pediatrics that at first said no screen time below the age of 2, and then they adjusted it to say video chat is fine. So when you think about this, and that is the case, why would video chat, like doing FaceTime, be okay? Well, with video chat, you can get all the same things we said were good language things, right? You have that contingency, you can have a conversation. When the kid says something syntactically incorrect, grandma on the other side can correct it the same way mom would. So they still get really good language interactions. It's when they're passively watching TV that's problematic. There also has been a little bit of an indication that preschoolers can learn from TV. However, they do this best when they're co-watching. So a parent's next to them talking to them about it. It gives them things to talk about, and then the parents can give more context and give, again, those interactions. There also is some indication that kids can learn a second language. This becomes an issue when we start to talk about bilingual families. There have been interviews with bilingual families who speak a language different in their home language than the mainstream language, who say, well, I want to have the TV on, say, in English, because I don't speak English very well, and I want them to have exposure to it. Does that work or not? We don't actually really know. We don't know the effects of that, but a lot of people feel that way, that this is a way to get exposure to that other language. So I think we know on average language or TV is problematic because it may get in the way of interactions, it may increase noise, but there are these other factors that I think are worth considering as we start to look into this. So in general, my point there was to say low-income homes on average are noisier, right? And we don't have a good indication of what the effects of that are over time, especially when we start to look at internal noise and the variability of what that internal noise is. And there's reason to think it could be really problematic. So we know that chronic noise leads to something like hearing loss, right? If you are constantly exposed to high levels of noise, that leads to hearing loss over time. Studies that are done with animals find that if you have an animal like a rat raised in an environment where there's constant low level noise, but this is constant, which isn't what kids are exposed to, right? Kids have higher levels and lower levels of noise. But when rats are raised in environments with constant levels of just white noise, it affects their brain development. Leads to disorganization of the brain. It leads to delays within brain development that then in turn lead to learning impairments. Would we see similar effects in kids? So is it possible that being raised in a really noisy environment leads to differences in brain development? We don't know, right? We obviously aren't going to raise children in a little box and find out what happens. So what we need to do is environmental studies to say, when we see what the noise environment is, does that lead to differences in brain development? We do know SES affects brain development and poverty does, which Kim Noble will be talking about fabulously, I'm sure, in our last talk of the series. But nobody studied to see if noise might be playing a role in that. So we don't really know that. One of the other things that is probably being affected is parental stress. So when we talk about noise in the home, the first term that usually comes up for people is like chaos, right? Noise equals chaos. And we know that when parents feel like they're in chaotic environments, that leads to higher stress levels. We know that parent stress levels affects parent-child interactions, and parent-child interactions are that basis of child language development. But parental stress is really interesting because how you perceive noise varies by person and by culture, right? So, and when Carlos and I were talking about these studies with some of the faculty here, you get a wide range of responses about noise. So some faculty are like, oh, when I moved here from New York, it was way too quiet. I hated it. I couldn't sleep. I needed to move somewhere louder. Or one of my colleagues from India who was like, no, a quiet home is horrible. You want to have noise. If my kids aren't home and other people aren't home, I turn on the TV, I turn on the radio. I need noise to be around me to feel comfortable. I am the opposite, right? Like I hate having noise in the home. I go into my parents and there's like talk radio and I turn it off right away. I can't stand background noise. That's stressful to me. So this becomes a really interesting factor of not just noise, which we can measure, but how do you feel about that noise? And that's going to differ. And we're going to have to get recordings of that information to see how does that affect parent-child interactions and how that could affect language development. So all of these things are a lot of unknowns in this field. Once we start to say, oh, kids are in noise, we're like, oh, wait a second, kids are in noise. That could be a problem. So our current question in the research that we've started doing is looking at, does a childhood in a noisy household affect language development? And we want to look at this again in these different areas. So just the auditory environment, is it noisy or not, right? That's one factor. The next is the language environment. What are the parent-child interactions, right? How many words are the kids hearing? Quantity and quality of language, conversational turns, all of that. But also a factor that we think is really important is if you are in a noisy environment, how do you respond to that? What is a parent's response to still provide really high quality language to their kids? Are they able to do that, and does that have an effect on the kid's outcome? So how are we going to do this? Well, we can measure the language environment, or we can measure the auditory environment using these little Lena device recorders, which Carlos had experience with, Megan's had experience with them, so they can talk about it, and I'm learning. It's great. These are really cool. So the kids wear these little recording devices, and with those you can get 16-hour-long, day-long recordings of all of what's going on in the environment, and especially what the kid is hearing, right? It's on the kid. So what is the auditory environment that the kid is being exposed to? And Lena has software that gives automated responses and can give us some of this data. Now, we need to still go in and get better responses. There are issues with the automatic responses that we'll talk about and we can delve into, but for today, we're giving you kind of these initial responses that the Lena device provides, or the Lena software. It gives you things like adult word counts, which means how many words by adults are within a close enough range for the kid to be able to hear it. So how many words are they hearing? That doesn't tell you if they're directed at the kid or not, but it tells you that that's language in the environment that the kid should have access to. It also tells you conversational turns. So the kid talks, an adult talks, the kid talks again. How often is that happening where they're getting that back and forth? Can also give you measures, and those measures are the ones most researchers who use Lena devices are interested in and analyzing in. Those are great measures. What we're also interested in then is the auditory environment. So how much noise is in the environment? And this can actually be broken down by things like overlapping speech. So when I'm talking to a kid, initially it's an adult signal, but if someone else starts talking, now it becomes overlapping speech. How usable is that for that kid? That might become noise. So we can start to tease apart, multiple speakers. Also distant speech, we get measures of just general outside noise, right? If a car comes by, if a siren goes by, all of that outside noise is in there too. There's also measures of TV and media, like the radio, television, just ongoing noise through that. And then one of the measures that Carlos has created gets to the parental response to noise. So if you are in a noisy environment, how do you change your signal to account for that? So specifically, are you adjusting the language that you're using so that you're still higher dB than the noise around you? And you can do this by talking louder, by moving closer, but basically if you know you're in a noisy environment, what do you do to make sure that the signal is something the kids can process? And we see this as another kind of newer form of parental responsivity, right? It's noticing what your child needs to communicate and reacting appropriately to it in the environment that you're in. And we think this is really important because, again, kids are going to be raised in noisy environments. So you're never going to be able to go into a parent and be like, okay, you got to move out to the country. You got to get rid of all these other people living here. It's got to be you and your kid and turn off the TV all day long. That's going to be awesome. You're going to have so much fun, right? Like, that's not going to happen. And you can't have people be like, too many people in the home, throw out your in-laws, they're gone. Or you have to tell your father-in-law to turn off the TV. Like, some people are like, no, you haven't done that. Like, some parents are going to be in noise. So can they account for that? And that's one of the things we want to start looking at. We're also going to measure child language. So we have this measure, the Quills, which is a language screener. This is a really nice measure because it gives, one, it's interactive. It's on an iPad, so it's super easy. The kids love it. They can just play on the iPad. It was created to give measures of language abilities in both English and Spanish. So a lot of screeners were done in English and then they translated it to Spanish, which is not necessarily the best way to test Spanish. It was also created with the idea that you're going to be testing a lot of bilingual speakers. So when we're looking at language development, taking into account children are learning 2 languages to see what their language abilities really are. So what this provides is a measure of vocabulary, so the words they know, syntax, their ability to put words together, process, or their ability to learn words within a language, and then combined scores for each language and across languages. So you have a score for English, a score for Spanish, and then you have combined language scores that accounts for both of those. Okay, so that's our study for what we're going to be looking at, and what we're going to be presenting today is this aspect of language environment, auditory environment, and parental response to noise. We do also have measures of brain structure and function with EEG with all of these kids. We're looking at how their brain is developing through resting state, as well as how it's processing, how the kids, not it, like the brain is part of the kid, how the child is processing spoken language. So if there are effects of that on their spoken language processing, as well as maternal stress. So we do have measures of maternal stress. We aren't reporting any of that today, but all of that is there as well. How we're doing this, so we are going to be studying children between the ages of 3 and 5 in primarily Spanish-speaking homes across a range of SESs. So why are we looking at Spanish speakers? This gives us way more insight into what a real life family looks like. So Spanish speakers in the Dallas area are much more likely to be multi-generational. We can get more diversity in SES when we know that SES and factors related to SES might be playing a role. We also can start to look at bilingualism and how things like TV and your views of like, oh, they need to be exposed to TV because that gives them English, how that might play a role. If we did the more typical way of doing research, which is the convenience of a sample of convenience, right, where we just see who would come in, we tend to get white, upper middle class, highly educated families. And in this area, that living environment means living in a big suburban house without any noise around you. And it's usually the mom and the dad and 1 to 2 kids. And we don't get a lot of the issues, or we can, but we may not be seeing a lot of the diversity of families that actually make up what is more typical in a US family and is more typical globally compared to when we test this kind of sample of convenience within the US. So this gives us a wider ability to look at things like number of people in the home, SES, overcrowding, multiple languages in families that aren't going to have any of those factors and families that will have a lot of them. So we are going to go ahead and give you our results so far. So Carlos.
Hello. Okay, so I'm going to take it from here. So as Mandy was saying, we've collected some data already. Specifically, we've collected data on 20 families, Spanish-speaking families. But today we're going to be we have analyzed 16 families so far. So that's the data that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay. So far we've analyzed the LINA data, all the measures that Mandy was mentioning before. And we have the language assessments in Spanish, English, and the combined scores. Then in the future, we're hoping to get more information about the language at home. We're going to transcribe not all the recordings, but some parts of the recordings. And then we're going to get into like more detailed measures about language, such as child-directed speech, for example, or the type of language that parents are using with their children, such as, you know, if they are using directives or they are responding to their child's needs, etc. Are we good? Okay. We are also looking at chaos within the home, subjective.
Sorry.
It's good. Okay. So we are looking at chaos within the home. We have some subjective measures, but also some objective measures of chaos, and we want to see how that relates to parental stress and how that relates to language development in these children. And then, of course, we have the EEG measures that Mandy was mentioning. So we are going to look at brain development overall using resting state, and we are also going to look at language processing using other methods within the EEG, but that will come later. So today we're going to focus on the LINA data and the QUILS measure, the language measures. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the demographics of these families. So we were hoping to get a range of SES within these Spanish-speaking families. In terms of maternal education, we were kind of surprised, I would say, that more than half of the sample had some college or a college degree. So these are highly educated moms. The funny thing I would say is that most of these moms are at home, like they are staying at home with their kids. So they have these degrees, but they stay at home, and that's tend to work instead of them. So more than 80% of these moms have at least some college. Then the mean annual income in these families is $61,000, which is kind of average. So these are no low-income families from an income standpoint. But then when we look at the average of number of people living in the homes, we found that on average we have 5 people living in these homes. And that ranges from 3, so that's just mom, dad, and the kid, but we also have like very extensive families with 9 family members living in the same house. So a lot of range there, and the mean is 5. So when we take into account that number of people living in the home, and we look at the income to noise ratios, so that's how the income relates to the number of people living in the home, we found that more than 50% of these families are low income or at poverty. So these are highly educated families, an average income, but then lots of people living in the home, so that puts them at low income or even at poverty in some cases. Okay, so now we can get into the nitty-gritty here. So we are going to look at the noise levels that we found. And we found that on average, the noise levels within these homes was 66 dB, and it ranged between 61 and 71 dB. So we don't really know what that means. So I'm going to bring the graph that Mandy was showing before. So that puts these families on average at a 60 dB. It's at safety, so they are in the safety zone. Like it's not a crazy loud sound. But if we think about the signal to noise ratio and how much louder these families need to speak to their children in order to make that speech accessible, these families should be talking at about 80 dB, and that's quite high. Like it's hard to keep your voice at 80 dB constantly throughout the day. Again, these are averages. So if we look at individual families, we would see that the noise levels vary throughout the day. So you have children exposed to 30 dB all the way up to 90 dB, but the average is 60 dB. So that's the most common SNR. And same for the speech levels. Like they vary, but on average, it is around 80 dB. Okay, so if we look at the difference, we get the signal to noise ratio, the average signal to noise ratio. And the average signal to noise ratio was 5 dB, around 4 to 5 dB, ranging from 1 to 8 dB or 9 dB. Okay, so again, these families are exposed, or these kids are exposed to signal to noise ratios that are well below the recommendation from ASHA. So in some part of the day, they are going to have trouble accessing the speech information. And we know that's going to be detrimental for learning. What about TV? So we found that children were exposed to TV 12% of their time on average, and it ranged from 3 to 21%. So there is quite a bit of variability. So to put that in a more comprehensible way, we estimated that children were exposed on average to a two-hour TV time during the day, ranging from 30 minutes to 4 hours. So the kid that was exposed the less was exposed 30 minutes, and the kid that had more exposure to TV was exposed to TV around 4 hours during the day. And that aligns with other previous studies looking at Hispanic-speaking families. Like they reported that children were exposed to TV 30% of their time. Okay, so we are in the ballpark of other studies. All right, so now we can look at the language scores. And we have Spanish first. For the quills, the normative sample, the average is 100. So we can see that these children are well above the average. Like the mean for the entire sample was 110. And we see the same pattern for every single subcategory. So vocabulary, syntax, and processing. Again, there is quite a bit of variability. Some children were below the mean, the 100 mean, and some children were above the mean. So so in English, we see the same pattern. On average, they are above the mean on the normative sample on all the aspects of language. So we can see that these children are high performing kids, like they are doing really, really, really well in their language. And that was kind of surprising, I would say, because they are doing really, really well. We think that this might be because we recruited these families from the Center for Children and Families and other programs similar to this one. We think that these might be like highly motivated families that get training from these programs, and they are able to use those resources, and that's impacting perhaps the language of these kids. So that's great to see. So in the future, we would like to recruit families that perhaps are not as highly motivated, so we can get a greater range of scores in language and see how that affects, how these variables affects those more ranging scores, okay? Another point that I want to make is that these are pretty balanced bilinguals. So children that did really well in Spanish are doing really well in English, and children that did not as good in Spanish are doing not as good in English. So they are developing both languages at the same rate, which is awesome too. Okay, so now we can ask the question, what predicts language abilities in these children? Because they are pretty balanced bilinguals, and they are doing both in both languages as well. We are going to use the combined scores from now on. So I'm reporting here combined scores from English and Spanish. And we have 4 candidates there: the adult word counts from the LINA, conversational turns, noise in the environment, and the signal-to-noise ratios that we are calculating. So when we do our analysis, we found that only conversational turns was a predictor of language skills in children. Of course, adult words and conversational turns are related, so parents that speak more tend to have more conversations, but there is no relationship between the adult word count and the language skills. Same from noise and signal-to-noise ratio. So the best single predictor is conversational turns. So how many conversations you are having, how many exchanges you are having with your child. Now, and we have the graph there. So in the y-axis we have the quill scores, and then in the x-axis we have the conversational turns. So more conversational turns predicting better language skills. So the next question that we ask is, what predicts conversational turns? So what makes families talk more in these environments? And we have TV media as a candidate, signal-to-noise ratios, noise, and then we also added maternal education and income. So what's a good predictor of conversational turns? What makes parents talk more? We found that 88% of the variability on language scores was accounted for these factors, so that's quite a lot. So we can explain a lot of variability via these factors. But we found that noise, income, and maternal education were not predictors of conversational turns. So these 2 predictors, the 2 strongest predictors were signal-to-noise ratios and TV. So signal-to-noise ratios was positively related, to conversational turns, so greater signal to noise ratio, so better auditory environment, predicting more conversational turns. And then media was the opposite. So we have a negative relationship. So more TV use or more TV exposure predicting lower conversational turns, which is what we've seen in previous studies as well. So how can we interpret these results? So we know that conversational turns predict language skills. We found that signal to noise ratios do not predict language skills, but they do predict conversational turns. So the way we interpret that is that scientifically, we will say that conversational turns is mediating the relationship between signal to noise ratios and language skills. So that means, to put it more simply, that increasing signal to noise ratios is beneficial for language, but only if you are having lots of conversations. So another way to put it would be that there are some families that are better able to adjust their communication with their children. So they get closer, they speak louder, and then that leads to more conversational turns. And as Mandy was saying before, we take that as a measure, as an index of parental responsivity. So what matters to language development is not how noisy the environment is, but how parents adjust to it when communicating with their kids, with their children. Similar relationship with media, but now we know that media is negatively related to conversational turns. So more media use leads to fewer conversational turns, so less parent-child interactions, and that leads to poorer language in our sample of children. So the reason TV negatively influences language development is conversational turns, not the fact that they are watching TV per se. So you are taking away time from parents to interact with their children. Okay, so some conclusions from this work. The language environment, again, this has been shown over and over again, and here we see it again. The language environment is a very important factor predicting language skills, and more specifically, conversational turns, so how much parents interact with their children. Children live in noisy environments. It's not a harmful environment for their hearing, but if we take into account signal to noise ratios, then we realize that for many a lot of time of the day, they might be having trouble accessing speech because signal to noise ratios are around +4 dB, and that's well below the +15 dB recommendation. But when families adjust their language to account for noise, children's language is stronger or is strong. So parents can get closer or they can speak louder. So signal to noise ratios can be seen as a measure of parental responsivity. So that's like the main point. In terms of TB affects language development because it's related to adult language and more specifically to conversational terms. And this is a finding that we've seen previously in the literature. So some take-home messages. Noise is an important factor in learning environments, and it's been overlooked related to language development. And of course, this is just the first steps on that area of research. So a lot of research is needed in order to really assess the impact of noise in language development, but that's what we want to do moving forward. More responsive parents adjust their speech to the environment, and that's beneficial for language development. TV takes away time from parents to interact with their children, and that could be detrimental for language development. So here, we don't want to get too ahead of the game because these are preliminary data. We are collecting more data, and we need more research to back up some type of intervention with these families. But at this time, we might be able to make some recommendations, I guess, or provide some advice for families. So it's important to note that noise at these levels, if a child is exposed to a 90 dB noise throughout the day, then that might be problematic. But at these levels, between 60 and 70, let's say between 55 and 70, that's fine. Noise is not necessarily problematic for their health. But parents need to adjust to it. So they can do different things. They can reduce the noise in the environment, so that's going to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. But as Mandy was saying before, maybe that's not realistic for some families. So I'm from Spain, for example. We live in apartment buildings, and families tend to be noisier. We have uncles and aunts coming over all the time, and it's always noisy, and that's the way it is. So sometimes it's not realistic to reduce the background noise. It's just a cultural thing, and you just have to deal with it. If that's the case, then you need to be aware of that and adjust your communication to those noise levels by coming closer, speaking louder. Maybe you can have some quiet times during the day where you know that you are focusing on your child. There is no noise around, and that's going to be really, really beneficial for the child. So those are some strategies. But there is a lot to discuss here. So maybe we can do that in the Q&A. And the main point, I guess, is that we need way more research in order to really understand the impact of noise in parent-child interactions and how that affects language development. But that's what we're going to be doing in the future, and we're very excited about what this research has to offer to us. So I think that's it. Thank you for listening. We want to thank all the families and all the children that took part of the study. Also the funding agencies like ASHA Foundation, NSF, and the UTD School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and of course all the students that are helping in this project and all the collaborators. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll take questions from here. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
so
of course.
I think maybe what we can do is I'll keep an eye on the chat and how those questions get asked. And I know that there are some hands up already, but I'm also going to take the liberty of asking the first question.
All right.
I'm just going to be selfish that way. So beautiful talk, super interesting. I think you gave us all a lot to think about in Q1. But one of your findings sort of stuck out to me because it's not consistent with a lot of the literature, right? So the fact that you're not seeing an association between maternal education and conversational turns, like that is just something that I think we see frequently. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to if that was surprising for you, if you have some ideas of what could account for that.
I'll say one thing so this has been found before in Hispanic low-income families, a lack of a relationship between maternal education and language outcomes. And it was published, there are 2 papers that have reported the same finding, and I can't remember them, and I have to find them, but it is surprising, and it's not what you expect. And Carlos had some ideas about it too, related to the father education and actually some of the dynamics. So do you want to say some of what you're finding?
Yeah, so if you look at these families, like mom has a college degree in general, but she's a stay-home mom, and dad is working outside the home, but he doesn't have a college degree. So I think these are kind of unique families in that regard, that there is a lot of discrepancy between the maternal education of mom and dad. They are highly motivated families. They all attend these programs. Yeah. So I think that might be playing a role, that these are kind of unique families in that regard.
And I would say that relationship between maternal education and paternal education is really highly linked in the U.S. That mother education, you can use that to predict father's education. It's not in this. They're which is interesting because then it shows it's always been mother education, but maybe there is a level to father education as well that we're not seeing because the mother education is accounting for a lot of that. You're also seeing more of a disconnect, I think, between education level and income in this population. And again, because the moms aren't working and fathers can get certainly, the job grade of what they're having is not a big income bringer, even though there's a high level of education. Again, most of their education also is done in Mexico, not in the US. So how that translates and how that's used within the US I think is also an issue that you have to think about. So I think all of them got their college degrees in Mexico. We have all that. So that may be playing a role as well. Not that it isn't as educated, but then how it translates and how it's used, and then the relationship to other factors in the home.
We do have a question from the chat. This is from Laura Purnell, and she asks, this was such an interesting talk, thank you. Has the use of negative speech been studied? That kids may be hearing more negative language directed to them and the effects of their psychological development as well. So she, in quotes, like, you aren't listening to me, frustrated prosody, so to speak, or so to speak, by the parent, and negative emotions that surround this language directed towards them. So like the psychological effects of this negative speech on kids.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on that. I think Mandy's more expert on the language aspect. We're going to use the transcribing piece to ask those type of questions. So what type of language parents are using and how that impacts language. But I don't know if you want to add on that.
So yeah, it's a good question, one we want to investigate in this for sure, but that'll take really deep diving into the data at a point we haven't been able to yet. But the findings to date are that that type of language does cut off the conversational turn, right? So instead of saying like, don't do that, then the kid, there's no response for the kid. So that cuts off and leads to fewer conversational turns, which in turn then you're missing that component to it. So I think we can think of that to some degree. The conversational turns is probably a very distant proxy measure of that, but to really look at it and then why parents use that type of language compared to more reciprocal language, I think is another issue related to this, right? Parent stress, parent demographics, like there are many reasons why you might do that. And what's leading to that language outcome and why might that be the case. But yeah, in general, that has been found to be less beneficial to language development because it shuts off conversational turns.
Yeah. Do we have any questions in the room here? There's more in the chat. So if you have a question, you can just speak up really loudly so they can hear you there. Otherwise, I can bring you a mic.
I have a question about the relationship between parents' education and the TV factor, I guess. So a lot of times we think about families who are trying to make ends meet, both parents are working all day long, and the kids are watching a lot of TV because there's not much else for them to do. But what about families with both parents are highly educated and they're also working all day long, and it's like a nice housing, nice, like more high income. And like say they have a nanny who lets them, the kids, watching a lot of TV, would the level of education of the parents kind of counteract the amount of TV watching?
That would be my guess. So the TV itself, if you look at even some of the studies that have looked at this, the strength of the relationship. Well, the strength of the relationship between SES and TV is actually not that strong. And there are some studies that show no relationship between SES and TV watching. When they do find one, it is that lower SES homes have the TV on more often, but it's not a super strong effect. So you do get a lot more of that where higher income families, plenty of high income families have a TV on all the time. And there's some really interesting, this made me delve into research on things like when parents put the TV on for their kid to eat, right? Which to us was like the time we were gonna look at parent-child interactions, and they're like, no, if the TV is not, and that's high income families, like just needs to be quiet so my kid will eat. You know, so you get into all these factors of why people use the TV and how they use it. That leads to a range of the effects, but by far the much stronger effect between those two would be the effect of income on the type of language in the home, which then affects the kids' language outcomes, where media is much more variable and not as highly linked to income level. Yeah.
So we're actually out of time. This is obviously a super interesting topic for everybody. So I think what we'll do is we'll sort of break. If folks in the room want to stick around and ask some additional questions, maybe you can come up and we can do that, but I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for kicking us off with such a wonderful, thought-provoking talk. And thank you everyone who joined virtually. I hope that's a good experience for everybody. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thank you. Should I close out of this then?
Yeah.
All right. S on there?
Let me just see if there's,
Okay.
looks like people are signing up.
Okay.
Can we stay? Yeah.
That was good. It forced us to analyze all the data.
Was that?
It was good because it forced us, gave us a deadline for
Yeah,
analyzing the
yeah.
data. So there you go. We needed
Hurry up.
that.
Yep.
Yes. Where did I just put my mask? Thank
you.
you. This was fun. There, I'm gonna mute that.
I don't know if they're still there.
They can always email. Is it someone who could email us?
Jane said she has a question. You can hear her, she unmuted, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah, we'd be able to hear.
Yeah.
We could take it off this so only we can hear. Maybe we don't need it coming throughout the whole room, but.
So Jane asked, will you be looking at differences between mothers and fathers specifically for conversational terms?
Yes, that's one of the REU student projects. So Vanish Shah, her question is, what are the, so we're gonna, and I didn't tell you this yet, we have to identify meal times where the father is in the house. And one of the measures is just how often is the father actually in the house during mealtime, which I think will be interesting to see. But then, yeah, she wants to look at father's conversational turns and mother's conversational turns and how that might play a role.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane.